The signal arrived at 3:14 inches the morning, and I was already awake. Not because I had been expecting it. Nobody expected it. Nobody in the history of our space program had seriously believed that the automated deep space receivers would one day pick up something that was not background radiation, stellar noise, or the quiet hum of our own satellites bouncing data off the dark. But there it was on my screen, clear as a lighthouse beam cutting through fog, a structured signal, layered, repeating, precise, arriving from a direction that our charts labelled as empty space, between the Carina and Sagittarius arms of the galaxy. My name is Yara Orsay. I was 38 years old, a communications specialist and deputy mission coordinator at the Deep Field Listening Array in northern Canada. I had spent 11 years pressing my ear, metaphorically speaking, against the wall of the universe and hearing nothing. That morning, the universe knocked back. I did not scream. I did not run. I sat very still for about 4 seconds, checked the signal against every known interference source in our database, found nothing, checked again, found nothing again, and then picked up my phone and called my director, Owen Clark, whose first word upon answering at that hour was a sound that was not really a word at all. "Owen," I said, "you need to come in." "Yara, it is 3 in the morning." "I know. You need to come in now." He came in. He looked at my screen. He sat down in the empty chair beside me. He was quiet for a long time. "Run it again," he said. I ran it again. The signal was not a random pulse. It was structured in base 12 mathematics, which no human engineering used and no natural stellar process produced. It contained repeating prime sequences nested inside what appeared to be a phonetic framework, as if the signal was designed to be decoded by any mind capable of recognizing patterns, regardless of what language that mind used. And buried inside the deepest layer, once we began peeling back the mathematics over the next 6 frantic hours, was something that translated with uncomfortable clarity into a message. It said, "You have been found capable. You are summoned to appear before the Celestial Galactic Council of Ancient Star Nations, convening at the coordinates listed below on the next available cycle of your solar calendar. Attendance is expected. This invitation does not repeat." Owen read it 4 times. Then he looked at me and said, "What does next available cycle mean?" "Best we can figure," I said. "It means whenever we can get there." "And how long ago was this sent?" I had already calculated that. The signal had originated from approximately 340 light years away, which meant it had been travelling for 340 years, which meant whoever sent it had aimed it at a version of Earth that had no electricity, no telescopes capable of detecting it, and no radio receivers of any kind. They had aimed it at a future version of us. They had assumed, 340 years ago, that by the time the signal arrived, we would be able to hear it. That thought sat in my chest, like a stone. Within 48 hours, the signal had been confirmed by 17 independent listening stations across 9 countries. Within 72 hours, every major government on the planet had been briefed. Within 1 week, the United Nations Space Coordination Office had issued an official response transmission, beamed back along the signal's origin vector in base 12 mathematics, carrying a single message. It said, "Humanity acknowledges the summons. We are coming." I was the one who composed that message. Owen had wanted something longer, more formal, more diplomatic. I argued for short. Whatever was out there, have been around long enough to have sent signals across centuries. They did not need us to explain ourselves in paragraph form. They needed to know one thing, that we had received the call and that we intended to show up. 3 years passed between that transmission and the day a ship appeared in high Earth orbit. Not our ship, theirs. I was part of the delegation selected to make first contact. 6 of us, chosen from a pool of candidates that included linguists, scientists, military officers, and diplomats. The others were Colin Webb, a physicist from Bristol who never stopped taking notes on anything. Priya Naya, a xenolinguist from Bangalore, who had spent her career developing theoretical frameworks for non-human communication. Daniel Ford, a former naval captain turned UN security advisor who assessed every new situation by asking what could go wrong first. Lena Schultz, a biologist specializing in extremophile life forms, and Owen, who insisted on coming, and nobody had the authority to stop. The escort vessel they sent was unlike anything our engineers had imagined. It was not sleek in the way our science fiction had always depicted alien spacecraft. It was enormous and ancient-looking, built from a dark mineral composite that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, shaped vaguely like a seed pod, several kilometers long, with no visible engines and no visible windows. It simply appeared in orbit one morning, already there, as if it had always been there and we had simply not noticed until now. A small transport separated from its surface and descended to our designated meeting site in neutral international waters in the Pacific, where our own shuttle waited on a platform vessel. The transport was maybe the size of a city bus. It opened without a sound. The being that stepped out was called a Vial. I know that now. In the moment, I only knew that it was tall, roughly insect in form, with 4 upper limbs that folded with mechanical precision, compound eyes that caught light in shifting geometric patterns, and a stillness of movement that was unsettling in a way I could not immediately name. It wore something that might have been a uniform, deep blue-black, with no visible insignia. It looked at all 6 of us for a very long moment. Then it spoke, and a translation device clipped to its collar converted its sounds into English, with a slight delay and a voice that was calm, flat, and utterly without warmth. "You are the human delegation." "We are," I said. "You responded to the summons in 72 hours. 71, actually," Colin said quietly. I gave him a look. The Vial's compound eyes shifted to Colin and then back to me. "The summons has been active for 10,000 years. No species in recorded council history has responded within a single generation of receiving it. You responded before the transmission echo had fully cleared your solar system's boundary. None of us said anything for a moment. Is that a problem?" Daniel asked. "It is unexpected," the Vial said. "You will board. There are procedures you must follow aboard the escort vessel and later within the council spire. You will speak only when addressed during formal session. You will not approach any council delegate without invitation. You will not touch the seat of voices under any circumstances." "Understood," I said. "One question before we board." The Vial paused. "Proceed. Is there a bathroom on the ship?" There was a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds. It felt much longer. "There is a designated biological maintenance facility," the Vial said finally, "adapted for your species' requirements based on the physiological data contained in your response transmission." "Perfect," I said. "Then we are ready." The interior of the escort vessel was not what I had expected. I had expected something alien and disorienting. Instead, it was simply large and quiet, with corridors wide enough for several humans to walk abreast, lighting calibrated to something close to natural daylight, and a gravity that felt fractionally lighter than Earth standard. There were other Vael aboard, moving through the corridors with that same unnerving stillness. They looked at us. We looked at them. Nobody said much. Owen walked beside me as we were led to our quarters, which turned out to be a clean, simply furnished set of rooms that smelled faintly of something metallic and not unpleasant. "This is real," he said quietly. It was not a question. "It is very real," I said. "Do you know how many times, over how many centuries, people looked at the sky and asked whether anyone was out there? Every single night," I said. "For as long as we have been human." He nodded, slowly. "We were travelling at a speed our instruments could not fully measure, and the stars outside the narrow observation slit in the corridor wall were not moving in any way I recognised. We were no longer anywhere near home. And somehow, despite everything, I was not afraid. I was the way you feel at the edge of something enormous and new, your heart beating faster than normal, your mind sharp and clear and paying attention to everything. That night, lying on a surface that was not quite a bed but close enough, listening to the quiet hum of a ship built by a civilization older than human language, I thought about the 71 hours it had taken us to respond. Every other species had taken longer. Most had taken generations. Some had never responded at all. We had not even finished our coffee. I smiled at the ceiling of an alien ship, somewhere between the stars, and fell asleep. The Council Spire was not a planet. It was not a station in the way we understood stations. It was something for which we genuinely did not have a word. From the outside, approaching in the smaller transit vessel that the escort ship released once we reached the designated coordinates, it looked like a structure built inside a nebula, a vast lattice of dark material threaded through clouds of violet and silver gas that caught starlight and held it. It was not spinning. It did not appear to have been constructed so much as grown, the way coral grows over immeasurable time, adding to itself in patterns that made a kind of sense from far away and became overwhelming up close. Daniel sat beside me at the observation window and said nothing for a long time. "How old do you think it is?" he asked, finally. "The Vael said the council has been in session for 9 million years, I said. He was quiet again. Then, "Right, of course it has." We docked without incident. The docking bay alone was large enough to contain every building in a mid-sized city. Our transit vessel was the smallest thing in it by a significant margin. Other ships were present, shapes and materials so varied that trying to classify them felt pointless. One appeared to be made entirely of something transparent. Another seemed to shift its outline slightly as I watched, as if it was not entirely committed to having a fixed shape. Colin was already writing in his notebook. The Vael escort led us through the spire, along corridors that changed their geometry in ways that my eyes accepted before my brain could argue. The lighting shifted colours as we walked, not dramatically, just enough to notice, cycling through spectrums that suggested the facility was calibrated for many different kinds of visual systems, not just ours. We were brought to a preparation chamber and told to wait. The Vael gave us a final briefing, delivered in the same flat, careful English of its translation device. The council chamber contains 7 delegations representing the 7 ancient star nations. You will be introduced as candidate species. The session will begin with the acknowledgement. which is a formal recognition of your presence. Following that, the assessment will begin. Each nation will address you in turn. You will listen. You may respond only after all 7 have spoken, and only when the seat of voices is offered to you. What is the seat of voices exactly? Priya asked. It is the speaking position at the center of the chamber floor. Only the delegate holding the recognized speaking token may occupy it. The token will be brought to you when it is your time. And before it is our time, I said, we just stand there. You stand in the observation position and you listen. For how long? Lena asked. The assessment has no fixed duration. The Doric nation alone holds the record for a continuous address lasting 11 of your years. We all looked at each other. Right, Owen said. 11 years. That record will likely not apply in your case, the Veil said, with what might have been diplomacy. Your species has a relatively brief history to assess. I chose not to respond to that. The council chamber was circular and enormous, rising to a height that disappeared into soft, ambient light far above. The floor was a dark, polished surface that reflected everything above it like still water. Around the outer ring, at elevated positions, the 7 delegations were arranged, each separated by a section of empty space that served as both a physical and symbolic boundary. I had been briefed on each of the 7 ancient star nations to the extent that our 3 years of preparation allowed. The Vael, our escorts, occupied one position, and seeing them in a group clarified something I had not noticed in the individuals I had met. They moved in a subtle coordination with each other, small adjustments of posture and limb angle that suggested a level of non-verbal communication running constantly beneath the surface of every interaction. The Doric occupied the largest elevated section, and they were extraordinary. They were crystalline in the most literal sense, bodies of semi-transparent mineral structure through which faint internal light pulsed in slow rhythms. The largest of them was perhaps 4 meters tall. They did not appear to move in real time. Between one glance and the next, a Doric would be in a slightly different position, but the transition was never visible. They simply were where they were. And then they were somewhere else. The Suthilorian were not visible in any conventional sense. Their designated section of the chamber contained what appeared to be a contained atmospheric phenomenon, shifting currents of pale gas and occasional points of concentrated luminescence. They were 9 million years old, the oldest civilization in the council. Their presence felt like standing near something vast and patient and deeply, incomprehensibly aware. The remaining 4 nations I will describe only briefly here, because my attention, in that first moment of entering the chamber, was not on cataloguing species. It was on the room itself, on the fact that I was standing in a place where civilizations came to speak to one another across the spans of their histories, a room that had been used for 9 million years for exactly this purpose, and that I, a woman from Accra, who had grown up reading science fiction under the covers with a flashlight, was standing in it as a representative of humanity. I took a breath. The acknowledgement began without announcement. One moment the chamber was still, and the next the veiled delegate at the highest position began to speak in a language that the translation system rendered into something approximating English, though the meaning arrived slightly ahead of the words, in a way that was difficult to explain. The Council recognizes the presence of the candidate species designated as humanity of the third planet of the Sol system. Their species age is approximately 300,000 years. Their technological development period is approximately 200 years. They arrived at these coordinates under their own power within 3 years of receiving the summons. The Council has not seen a response time of this speed in its recorded history. That last sentence landed in the chamber and sat there. I kept my face calm. Daniel, standing at my left, had his hands clasped behind his back in a posture I recognized from years of watching him prepare for situations he had decided to treat as normal until proven otherwise. The assessment began with the Vial, who were actually the most temperate. They noted our youth, our limited range, our biological fragility, our short individual lifespans, all delivered with the tone of someone reading from a technical document, not unkind, simply factual, in the way that a geological survey is factual. We were measured and found to be early. The second nation, a species called the Orin, communicated through patterns of light emitted from structures along their bodies. The translation came in careful, layered phrases. They spoke of our resource consumption, the damage we had done to our home planet, the speed with which we had nearly exhausted our biosphere's tolerance for our own industry. They were not wrong. I stood and listened and did not look away from the patterns of light that constituted their words. The third nation said nothing for a very long time. Then a sound emerged from their section that the translator rendered as a sustained question. Do humans understand what they are? Nobody was looking at me to answer. It was not yet my turn. The Dorak began their address in the fourth position. They had been present at council sessions older than human civilization by a factor of 30. When the lead Dorak spoke, the translation came slowly, each phrase deliberate and weighted, as if meaning required time to settle properly into language. They began with Mesopotamia. They went forward from there. Every significant human conflict, every period of large-scale destruction, every example of our species choosing to cause harm at scale was catalogued in measured, crystalline detail. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. I counted because counting gave me something to do with the part of my brain that wanted to react. When the Dorak finished, the chamber was silent. I became aware that all 7 delegations were now looking at the 6 of us. Not hostile, not contemptuous, something else. Something that felt more like the attention of a doctor examining a patient whose symptoms did not match any known condition. And then the speaking token was brought to me. It was a small object, barely the size of my hand, made of some material that was warm to the touch and faintly luminous. The Vial delegate carried it across the chamber floor and placed it in my hands without a word. I walked to the center of the chamber. The seat of voices was not a throne or a platform. It was simply the center point of the floor, marked by a circular inlay of different material, and standing on it felt like standing at the center of something very old, paying very close attention to you. I looked up at 7 ancient civilizations looking down at me. I did not defend us. I did not apologize. I did not list our achievements in a way that would invite comparison to theirs, because that comparison was not survivable and also not the point. Instead, I said, you have each spent your time telling us what you have found when you looked at humanity. I would like to ask one question before I respond. The chamber was absolutely still. What have the Star Nations built in the last 1,000 years. The silence that followed was the longest I had ever experienced in a room full of people, or beings, or whatever the correct word was for the assembled representatives of 9 million years of galactic civilization. The Vile liaison, standing at the edge of the chamber, had gone very still in a way that was different from the Veil's ordinary stillness. Later, when we were back in the preparation chamber, they would tell me in a low, careful voice, "In 9 million years of recorded council sessions, no candidate species has ever answered the assessment with a question directed at the council itself." "Was that a problem?" I asked. The Veil was quiet for a moment. "We are still determining that." I stood in the center of the chamber and waited. 7 ancient civilizations considered their answer, and for the first time since we had entered the spire, the assembled representatives of the oldest known minds in the galaxy looked at the youngest species ever to stand in that room and seemed, for just a moment, to be genuinely unsure of what came next. The memory right was not something I had been fully prepared for. The briefings had described it. Each nation submits a crystallized record of their civilization's history, to be read by the Council's archive system and made available to all present. It was meant to be a formality, one more step in the assessment, a way for the Council to understand us through our own account of ourselves rather than through external observation alone. What the briefings had not conveyed was what it actually felt like to stand in that chamber while our record was read. Priya had spent the better part of our 3-year preparation period helping to compile the human archive. She had led a global effort, coordinating with universities, libraries, cultural institutions, and governments across every continent. The result was not a curated highlight reel, it was everything, or as close to everything as could be compressed into the data format the Vielle had provided for the submission. It contained the oldest cave paintings we had found. It contained the construction records of the pyramids and the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci and the complete works of Shakespeare and the score of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, written by a man who could not hear a single note of it. It contained the blueprints of the first airplane, and the mission logs of the Apollo program, and the recorded testimonies of people who had survived some of the worst events in human history and had lived to describe them. It contained children's drawings. It contained love letters. It contained the last entries of diaries found in places where history had been most cruel. It contained the full catalogue of every species we had documented on Earth. It contained maps of every ocean floor we had explored and every mountain range we had named and every star we had identified and assigned a human word to, even the ones we could never reach. It contained whale song. The Council's archive reader was a device built into the chamber floor, a broad, flat surface of interlocking components that the Vielle said had been used for 9 million years to process the historical records of civilizations whose ages ranged from tens of thousands to millions of years. It was, presumably, very good at its job. It had read the calm, measured archives of ancient species that had long since resolved their internal contradictions and settled into stable patterns of existence. It had never read us before. The archive reader began processing the human submission. For about 40 seconds, nothing visible happened. Then the lights in the chamber shifted in a way that I did not understand, but that made every delegate present turn to look at the reader. Then the reader stopped. A sound came from it that the translation system did not convert into language because it was not language. It was a sound that a machine makes when it encounters something that exceeds its calibration. The Dorak delegate closest to the reader moved, which was notable because Dorak movement was always deliberate and rare. It approached the reader and examined it in the way that only a crystalline being 3 million years old can examine something, with a quality of attention that felt geological. The archive reader has paused, the Vial liaison said quietly, appearing at my side. I can see that, I said. Is it damaged? It is not damaged. It has initiated a recalibration sequence. The Veil's compound eyes shifted to look at me. This has not happened before. Owen, standing a few paces behind me, leaned forward. What does recalibration mean in this context? It means the system encountered a volume and pattern complexity of emotional data that exceeded its standard processing parameters, the Veil said carefully. The archive reader is designed to handle historical records. It is not designed to handle... The Vial paused. To handle what? Priya asked. Simultaneous contradictions at scale, the Vial said. Your record contains acts of extraordinary cruelty and acts of extraordinary compassion occurring within the same time periods, sometimes involving the same individuals. It contains creation and destruction as continuous, overlapping processes rather than sequential phases of development. The system was designed by civilizations that had resolved such contradictions before submitting their records. It requires time to adjust its framework. The chamber was quiet in a way that felt different from earlier silences. The earlier silences had been the council paying attention to us. This silence felt like the council paying attention to itself, to what our presence in the room was requiring of its oldest systems. I looked at the Suthalorian section. The pale currents of gas and light that constituted the oldest intelligence in the council were moving in a pattern I had not seen before, tighter and slower than the drifting movement they had shown throughout the session. Something in that pattern suggested, without any translation required, a quality of deep and focused thought. Then the Suthalorian spoke. They had been silent for the entire session until that moment. Their voice, when it came through the translation system, was not loud, but it was the kind of sound that fills a room completely, the way a low organ note fills a cathedral. This species has not yet decided what it is. 7 words, or the translation of 7 words. And every delegate in the chamber was still. I was holding the speaking token. It had been returned to me after the archive reader paused, as if the council needed me to be ready to speak, but was not yet ready to hear me. I held it, and I looked at the Suthalorian section, at those slow, concentrated currents of light, and I said, not loudly, not performing, just saying it. No. But we work on it every day. The Suthalorian was still for a long moment. Then the currents resumed their natural drift, and something in the rhythm of them felt, though I could not explain why, like an acknowledgement. The archive reader completed its recalibration and resumed processing. What followed was unlike anything the council chamber had apparently witnessed before. The historical record of a species plays through the reader's systems, and the output is a kind of structured resonance that all present can perceive in their respective sensory frameworks. For the other nations' records, this had always been, according to the Vial's later description, a calm and ordered experience, like reading a well-organized document. Ours was not calm. What filled the chamber was not chaos exactly, but something close to what chaos sounds like when it is also trying its hardest to be beautiful. The music came through first, layered and overlapping. because our musical tradition had never agreed on a single form and never would. Underneath it ran the mathematics of our scientific development. Not smooth progress, but full of dead ends and corrections and moments where someone had believed completely the wrong thing for decades before someone else, working from a completely different direction, found a better answer. Through both of those ran the human voices, fragments of recorded speech, prayers and arguments and declarations and discoveries and ordinary conversations and screams and laughter, all of it simultaneous, all of it honest. Colin told me later that he watched the Dvorak during this period. He said the internal light that pulsed through their crystalline bodies, which always moved in slow, even rhythms, became irregular for approximately 7 minutes. He said he had never seen anything described in any xenobiological briefing that corresponded to this. He called it, in his notes, the closest thing to surprise that a 3 million year-old mineral intelligence was probably capable of expressing. Lena watched the Orin, whose light pattern communication ran faster than usual, their language flickering at a rate that suggested a conversation happening between them that none of our translation systems could follow. Priya watched the Vael, who were watching us. I watched all of it. All of the delegations, all of the ancient minds in that room, encountering the full record of what we were. Not our best moments alone, not our worst moments alone. The whole thing, raw and unedited and contradictory, and ours. When it ended, the chamber was quiet for a very long time. Then the lead Vael delegate, who held the highest speaking position in the council hierarchy, said something that the translation system rendered as, "The council will recess to consider the assessment." We were escorted back to the preparation chamber. Priya sat down immediately and said nothing for several minutes. Daniel stood with his back against the wall. Lena paced. Owen sat beside Priya and stared at the middle distance. Colin wrote in his notebook. I stood near the entrance and thought about the Suthalorian's 7 words. This species has not yet decided what it is. And I thought about my answer. Not the words themselves, which had been honest and unrehearsed, but the thing behind them. The reason it was true, we had not decided what we were, because we were still becoming something. And the becoming was not finished. It might never be finished. Every generation of humans inherited a world that their parents had left imperfect, added their own imperfections, and also added their own beauty and their own discovery and their own love, which was real even when everything else was hard. We were not a completed civilization. We were a civilization in the act of becoming one, and the act was sometimes painful and sometimes extraordinary and never boring. The Vael liaison came to us after 3 hours. The council will resume session in 1 period, which approximates 6 of your hours, it said. There will be a formal vote on your species status, admission, observation, or restricted contact. What does restricted contact mean? Daniel asked. It means the council agrees to monitor your development, but establishes a boundary perimeter around your system, preventing your expansion beyond a defined range until you are deemed ready for broader galactic interaction. A cage, Daniel said. A boundary, the Vael said. Precisely. And observation? I asked. A watch status. You are known to the council, but not admitted to its formal proceedings. You may develop freely, but are not entitled to council resources, protections, or communication rights. And admission? You become a recognized member. You are entitled to a permanent presence at council sessions. You receive access to council archives, protection accords, and the right to raise matters before the full assembly. None of us spoke for a moment. What are our chances? Owen asked quietly. The Vale considered this in the careful way it considered everything. The Dorak and 2 other nations have historically favoured restricted contact for young species. 2 nations have indicated observation as their preference. 2 have not yet indicated. The deciding voice, if there is no consensus, may fall to the Suthilorian, who have not cast a formal vote in 11,000 years. They abstained for 11,000 years? Lena said. They found no case that required their voice, the Vale said. Until now, perhaps. The Vael left us. I sat down. 6 hours until the vote. 6 hours in which the oldest minds in the galaxy would decide what our place in it would be, at least for now, at least until we proved or disproved whatever they had concluded about us. I thought about everything we had shown them. The cave paintings and the calculus and the whale song and the terrible things and the beautiful things, all of it together, inseparable, because that was what we were. Inseparable from our own contradictions. I thought about a small machine launched in 1977, carrying music and mathematics and the sound of a mother's voice into the dark between stars, aimed at nobody in particular, sent because we could not stand the idea of being silent. And I thought, whatever they decide, we were here. We came when called. We showed them exactly who we were. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything we had. The preparation chamber was quiet. Somewhere far above us, in the oldest room in the galaxy, 7 civilizations were making up their minds about humanity. I closed my eyes and waited. The council chamber looked different when we returned to it. I could not have explained why, exactly. The same delegations occupied the same elevated positions. The same dark reflective floor showed the same upside-down image of everything above it. The archive reader stood silent and still. The seat of voices waited at the centre, but something in the quality of attention in the room had changed. During the assessment and the memory rite, the council had been watching us the way scientists watch an experiment. Now it felt as though they were watching us, the way you watch something when you already know your conclusion and are simply checking one final time that you have not missed anything. I did not find that comforting. The Vael liaison had been very clear in its final briefing before we re-entered the chamber. The vote would proceed in order of civilizational age, youngest first, oldest last. Each nation would state its position. If 6 of the 7 agreed, the vote was resolved without further process. If there was no agreement of 6, the full council would deliberate until consensus was reached, or until the oldest voice, the Sooth Elorian, chose to speak definitively. The Vael went first, as the youngest of the ancient star nations. At a modest 800,000 years, the delegate who had been our escort since Earth, the same being who had asked us whether we understood the length of the summons delay, spoke in its own language and waited for the translation. The Vael nation recommends observation status. Humanity is a young species of significant instability and significant potential. Premature admission carries risk. Extended restriction is not warranted. We recommend watching closely. I had expected this. It was, in many ways, the kindest of the 3 options, and also the one that kept the most distance. The Orin went second. Their light patterns ran through the translation system and emerged as, the Orin nation recommends restricted contact. The candidate species has demonstrated no capacity to manage its own expansion without causing harm to its environment. Unrestricted development at current trajectory poses risk to neighboring systems within 200 years. 200 years felt both distant and close. Daniel made no visible reaction, neither did I. The third nation, whose name translated approximately as the Still Waters Civilization, a species that communicated through long-wave vibrations and had been in council for 1.2 million years, took several minutes to speak. Their translated position, when it arrived, was restricted contact. The candidate species requires more time. 3 votes, all 3 for either observation or restricted contact, none for admission. The fourth nation, the hollow light carriers, who were non-corporeal in a way that meant their physical presence in the chamber was represented by a contained energy pattern similar to, but distinct from, the Suthilorians' recommended observation. For vote, 0 for admission. My hands were relaxed at my sides. Behind me, I could feel the stillness of Owen and the others, that particular human quality of holding very steady when you are not actually calm. The fifth nation, the Dorak, did not speak quickly. They never spoke quickly. The lead Dorak shifted position, which took approximately 40 seconds to visibly complete, and then the slow, weighted words came through. The Dorak nation recommends restricted contact. This species is young. Its record contains patterns of self-harm at civilizational scale that have not been resolved. Admission would grant access to council resources and protections that could accelerate its expansion before it has demonstrated the capacity to use such access responsibly. The Dorak Nation votes restricted contact and recommends a review period of no less than 10,000 years. 5 votes, 3 for restricted contact, 2 for observation, 0 for admission. For admission to pass, the remaining 2 nations and the Suthilorian would all need to vote in our favor, and even then, the majority would still favor restriction. The mathematics were not with us. The 6th nation, the Singing Deep, a species that had developed in the interior of a gas giant and whose sensory experience of the universe was radically different from any surface-dwelling life, took longer to translate. Their language was structured around resonance and depth rather than linear sound, and the translation system worked visibly harder on their input. When their position emerged, it was observation. The Singing Deep does not oppose contact, but does not yet support full inclusion. 6 votes cast, 6 for observation or restricted contact. The Suthilorian had not yet spoken. Under council rules, the Suthilorians' vote would finalize the tally. If they voted admission, the result would be 4 restricted contact, 2 observation, 1 admission, and the majority would still prevent our inclusion. The math had not changed. But then, as the 7th speaking position came to bear, and the slow currents of the Suthilorian began their shift toward language, the Viel liaison moved from its position at the edge of the chamber to stand closer to the center. This was unusual. I noticed it. I noticed everything in that room. Before the 7th voice is heard, the lead Viel delegate said, "Under council procedure as established in session 4441, an unresolved candidate delegation may request the right to address the full council prior to the final vote, provided the speaking token has not yet been retired." I had not known this provision existed. The Viel had not mentioned it in any briefing. I turned to look at the liaison and found it already looking at me. It said nothing. It did not need to. I raised my hand. It was a human gesture. meaning nothing to any other species in the room, but it was mine and I used it. The human delegation requests the right of final address, I said. There was a pause. The lead Vial delegate conferred briefly in their non-verbal way with the others. Then, the request is granted under standing provision. The speaking token will be brought to the candidate delegate. The small, warm object was placed in my hands for the third time. I walked to the center of the chamber. I stood on the inlay that marked the seat of voices and looked up at 6 ancient civilizations that had already decided against us, and one that had not yet spoken. I had not prepared a speech. There had been no point preparing one because I had not known this option existed. Everything I said in the next few minutes would be the first thing that came, and it would be real, and it would be ours. I said, in 1977, which is recent by any standard in this room, our species launched 2 small spacecraft. We called them Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. They were not large. They were not fast by the standards of anything in this chamber. They carried scientific instruments, and they carried something else, a golden record. A disc made of metal, containing sounds and images chosen to represent what we were. The chamber was completely still. It contained music from many different cultures, many different instruments, many different centuries. It contained natural sounds from our planet, wind and rain and ocean waves and the calls of animals. It contained greetings spoken by human voices in 55 different languages. It contained the mathematical coordinates of our solar system. It contained a human heartbeat. I paused. I was not performing. I was remembering. Those probes are still moving. Right now, as I stand here, Voyager 1 is beyond the edge of our solar system, traveling through the space between stars. It will not reach the nearest star to our sun for approximately 40,000 years. Nobody alive today will be alive when that happens. Nobody who built those probes, nobody who chose those recordings, nobody who listened to those sounds and decided they were the right ones to carry into the dark will ever know whether they were heard. I looked at the Sutherlorian section. The currents of gas and light were very still. We sent them anyway. Not because we had any reason to believe anyone was out there. Not because it made scientific sense to spend resources on a message with no guaranteed recipient. We sent them because we could not stand the idea of going into the universe with nothing in our hands. We sent them because the universe is enormous and we are small, and we wanted, more than almost anything, to say hello. Nobody in the chamber moved or spoke. I am not going to argue that humanity deserves a seat at this table. I do not know if we deserve it. Honestly, I am not sure any of us do, no matter how old they are. What I know is that we are here. We came when called. We showed you everything, not just the parts we are proud of, all of it, because that is also who we are. We are a species that makes serious mistakes and then argues about them for generations and sometimes fixes them and sometimes makes new ones. We are also a species that sends golden records into the dark because we believe, even without evidence, that the universe is worth talking to. I took a breath. You have been out here for 9 million years. In that time, however many species have come and gone, and however many wonders you have witnessed, you have not seen this from us before, because we were not here before. We are here now, and wherever we go from this chamber, whether you let us stay or send us home to watch from a distance, we are going to keep sending things into the dark. We are going to keep reaching. That is not going to change. I stepped off the inlay. I walked back to where the others stood, and I held the speaking token at my side, and I did not look at anyone for a moment, because something in my chest was working very hard to stay where it was, and I needed a second. Daniel put his hand on my shoulder, briefly, and said nothing. The chamber was silent for 11 minutes. The Veil liaison told me this later, having timed it. 11 minutes of complete silence was, apparently, the longest unstructured pause in recorded council history. Then the Sooth Ilorians spoke. Their voice filled the chamber, the way deep water fills a vessel, completely without forcing. The Sooth Ilorian nation votes admission. The Veil liaison's posture changed in a way I had never seen a Veil posture change before. Something in the arrangement of their upper limbs shifted from the formal positioning they had held throughout the session. The lead Veil delegate said, "The seventh voice is recorded. The vote total stands as follows. 4 votes for restricted contact, 2 votes for observation, 1 vote for admission. Under council law, a vote of admission requires," and then the Stillwater civilization spoke again. They had already voted. Speaking again was, from what I understood of council procedure, extraordinarily unusual. Their long-wave translation came slowly. The Stillwater's civilization amends its vote. Admission. Another silence. Then the Hollow Light Carriers. Amendment submitted. Admission. And then, after a pause that lasted long enough for me to look at Owen and see something in his face that I had never seen there in 11 years of working beside him, the lead Veil delegate said, 4 votes for restricted contact, 1 vote for observation, 3 votes for admission. The council will deliberate. The deliberation, in the end, took 9 hours. We waited in the preparation chamber. Nobody slept. Lena made tea from a kit she had brought from Earth, because she had said before we left that she was not going anywhere in the galaxy without the ability to make a proper cup of tea, and she had been right. At some point during the 9th hour, the Veil liaison entered the preparation chamber. It looked at me. It said, in the flat, translated voice that I had come to recognize as capable of conveying more than its tone suggested, "The Dorak nation has amended its position under a provision that has not been invoked in recorded council history. A nation may downgrade its vote in response to information received during session that was not available at the time of initial voting. The Dorak have moved from restricted contact to observation." I stared at it. What information? The archive reader's recalibration data, the Veil said. The Dorak study system failures very carefully. They found the data from our reader's response to your archive significant. Significant enough to change their vote? Significant enough to remove their objection, the Veil said, which in Dorak terms is equivalent. The vote then stood at 4 for admission, 2 for observation, 1 for restricted contact. The majority was clear. When the Veil liaison told me the final result, standing in the doorway of a preparation room in a structure 9 million years old, somewhere in a nebula 340 light years from Earth, it said, "Humanity has been admitted to the Celestial Galactic Council of Ancient Star Nations as a recognized candidate member. You will be assigned a formal council seat and a protocol liaison. Permanent ambassador credentials will be issued. You will be expected to attend regular sessions." I nodded. "There is one more thing," the Veil said. The Suthilorian requested that a message be conveyed to the human delegation. What was the message? The Veil's translation system rendered it as, "We have not sent anything into the dark in 4 million years. We had forgotten what it meant to reach. 10 years later, I am still the standing human ambassador to the Celestial Galactic Council of Ancient Star Nations. My office, if you want to call it that, is a set of rooms in the council spire that were reconfigured for human occupancy, which mostly meant adjusting the gravity, adding something that functions reasonably well as a bed, and installing a kitchen unit that can approximate the chemical composition of coffee to within a margin that is, after some initial difficult mornings, acceptable. I have been home to Earth 11 times in 10 years. Each time I go back, something is a little different. The world knows what is out here now. That knowledge has changed things. Not all at once, not dramatically in the way science fiction always imagined, but in the way that real change happens, gradually, in the choices people make when they understand the scale of the thing they are part of. When I first arrived on the council, as its newest and youngest and least technologically advanced member, I was assigned a seat at the outermost ring of the formal assembly, which was the procedurally correct position for a candidate member. I was told, politely but clearly, that candidate members observed, consulted senior members before speaking, and raised matters through established protocol channels. Within 6 months, I had raised 3 agenda items that had not been on any council docket in living memory, which for some of these civilizations meant memory extending back hundreds of thousands of years. The first was a proposal for a refugee protocol covering species whose home star systems were entering terminal phases. The council had a process for documenting such events. It did not have a process for actually helping the species affected. I asked why not. There was a very long silence. I had learned to be comfortable with those. Then, the singing deep, speaking in their resonant way, said that the question had not previously been raised in that form. I said, I am raising it now. It took 4 years to draft the protocol. It is not perfect. It is the first of its kind in council history. The second proposal was a shared medical archive, a repository of biological and medical knowledge accessible to any council member dealing with a health crisis beyond their own research capacity. The Dorak had initially objected on grounds of data sovereignty. We negotiated for 14 months. The archive now exists and has been accessed by 3 civilizations, including, once, by the Dorak themselves, who did not comment on this publicly, but who also, from that point forward, have not objected to a single human agenda item. The third was an arts council, a formal body within the council structure dedicated to the exchange of creative works between civilizations. I had expected resistance. The resistance was unanimous, enthusiastic, and from every direction. The Orin said creativity was not a council matter. The Still Waters civilization said the concept was undefined. The Vial said there was no procedural framework for its establishment. I said, then we will make one. We are still working on it. I have strong feelings about the timeline. My liaison, the Vial, who had met us on the platform vessel in the Pacific 10 years ago, is the closest thing I have to a colleague in the formal diplomatic sense, and something close to a friend in the human sense, though I have never tested whether that word applies by using it aloud. We have established a working relationship built on mutual professional respect, shared institutional knowledge, and an ongoing disagreement about whether human meeting customs, specifically the concept of small talk as a relationship-building tool, constitute a legitimate diplomatic practice or an inefficiency. I believe they are a legitimate practice. The Veil believes efficiency is self-evidently superior. I have pointed out that the Veil's opening approach to our delegation on Earth was so efficient it nearly caused an international incident when a naval officer in the escort fleet misread the escort vessel's approach vector as hostile. The Veil has not conceded this point. We continue to discuss it. 3 months ago, during a standard session break, my Veil liaison came and stood beside me at the observation window that overlooks the nebula surrounding the spire. We stood there in silence for a while. This is something we have done on a number of occasions. The Veil do not find silence uncomfortable. Neither, after 10 years in this place, do I. Then the Veil said, "There is a data point I have been holding for the appropriate moment." "What is it?" I asked. "When your delegation first arrived and I briefed you on council procedure, you asked about a biological maintenance facility. I remember. I have reviewed the interaction records of every candidate species delegation in council history," the Veil said. "Yours was the first to ask about sanitation within the first 60 seconds of first contact. Is that a problem?" I asked. "No," the Veil said. "It is a data point. Specifically, it indicates that your species prioritizes the practical resolution of immediate biological requirements even in the presence of overwhelming historical and diplomatic significance. This is either a sign of poor prioritization or extremely good ones. Which do you think?" I asked. The Veil was quiet for a moment. For a Veil, this meant they were considering something carefully rather than simply not having spoken yet. "I think," the Veil said, "that a species which does not forget its body exists is also a species that does not forget it is alive. And species that forget they are alive tend not to do things like send gold records into the dark." I looked at it. "That was almost a compliment," I said. "It was a data point," the Veil said firmly. I smiled. We looked out at the nebula. I end every log entry the same way because some habits, once started, feel wrong to stop. I note the current coordinates of Voyager 1 updated from the latest positional data transmitted by our deep space tracking network. Right now, as I write this from a room in the oldest structure humanity has ever entered, Voyager 1 is approximately 23.6 billion kilometers from Earth and moving steadily outward. It is carrying, as it has always carried, the sounds of rain and wind and ocean. It carries music from cultures that have since changed and evolved. It carries greetings in languages some of whose speakers are no longer living. It carries a human heartbeat, recorded decades ago from someone whose name I do not know, whose heart beat steadily into a microphone so that the sound of being alive might travel to wherever alive things might be listening. It has been traveling for almost 50 years in the direction of a star it will not reach for 40,000 more. Nobody who built it will be there when it arrives. Nobody who is alive today will see what happens next. We sent it anyway. That is what we are. Not the species that arrived at the council fastest, though we did. Not the species that broke the archive reader, though we did that too. Not the species that asked about the bathroom in the first 60 seconds of galactic diplomacy, though that is apparently now in the records. We are the species that could not stand the silence. That had to reach, even when reaching seemed pointless. That sent our voices out into the dark, not because we knew anyone was listening, but because the alternative was to say nothing, and saying nothing has never once in our entire history felt like an option. The council is changing. Slowly, grudgingly. in the way that only happens when something genuinely new enters a very old room and refuses to make itself smaller to fit more comfortably inside it. There's now a refugee protocol where there was none. There's a shared medical archive where there was none. There's a draft framework, imperfect and incomplete, for an arts exchange program. And I have personally sat through 47 procedural meetings about it, and I will sit through 47 more. The Dorak, who voted against us twice and have not apologized for it, and will not, recently asked me, in the careful, weighted way they ask everything, why humans create art during periods of crisis. I spent an entire afternoon trying to explain it. At the end, the Dorak said, "You make things when you are afraid." I said, "Yes." The Dorak considered this for a long time. Then they said, "We stopped doing that 2 million years ago." I said, "I know. I am sorry." They said, "Do not be sorry. It is a data point. Apparently, I am surrounded by beings who speak in data points. I find it, oddly, comforting." Lena is back on Earth now, leading a team studying the biological exchange protocols that the Council has allowed us access to through the archive. 3 million years of xenobiology that our scientists are working through with an urgency that I recognize from the early days of our space program. Colin is somewhere in the spire today, in a consultation with the Singing Deep about acoustic mathematics, which has been going on for 3 months and shows no sign of concluding, and which Colin describes in his weekly dispatches as the best 3 months of his life. Priya is at the Council's secondary archive site, which I had not known existed until she found it, cataloguing the communication systems of extinct civilizations, species that rose and spoke and fell before humanity had discovered fire. Daniel is back on Earth, working with the UN office that coordinates with the Council liaison program. He sends me news from home. Last week, he sent a photograph of his granddaughter, born 6 months ago, who he says has his wife's eyes and nobody's patience. Owen passed away 2 years ago. He was 74. He died on Earth, in his house, in a city he had grown up in a bed his children were sitting around, knowing that the universe was larger and stranger and more populated than any human generation before his had known. I was in the Council spire when it happened. I found out through the communication relay that the Council now maintains between the spire and Earth. I sat by the observation window for a long time that afternoon. The nebula outside was the same violet and silver it always is. The oldest room in the galaxy was quiet around me. I thought about the morning in Canada, when Owen had sat down beside me and looked at a screen and said, "Run it again," in the voice of a man who already believed it but needed 1 more second to let it become real. I thought about the way he had looked standing in our quarters on the escort vessel, saying, "This is real," not asking, just saying it, because sometimes the most important things need to be said aloud to settle properly into the world. He had lived to see humanity admitted to the Council. He had stood in that chamber. He had been present for all of it. That is not a small life. That is not a small thing to have been part of. I lit a small candle that evening, a simple one I had brought from Earth because some rituals need no explanation. I sat with it until it went out on its own. The next morning, I was back in session. The Arts Council framework was on the agenda. The Dorak had 17 amendments. I had printed responses to all 17, because sometimes the most useful thing a young species can bring to a very old room is the willingness to do the homework. Outside, somewhere in the dark between stars, Voyager 1 was moving, steadily, without stopping, carrying what we had chosen to carry, in the direction of whatever came next. I picked up my notes. I walked into the oldest room in the galaxy. We were still here. We were still reaching, and we were absolutely, completely, stubbornly not done